I'm Maria Noël Groves, owner of Wintergreen Botanicals and author of Body into Balance and Grow Your Own Herbal Remedies. Today we are here with mountain rose herbs to make a herbal salve, and we already made some really lovely plantain oil, so this is something we could use for soothing the skin, occasional itching, and we're going to basically just melt it down with some beeswax and turn it into a salve consistency. And this is something that you can do to make lip balm, but you can also use it to make a wide array of various healing salves. It's a really easy remedy to make, and the finished product is really beautiful and relatively shelf stable as well. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is prep our beeswax, and I usually prefer to get chunks of beeswax and then break it up into smaller pieces for easier melting. You can also get the pastilles, and Mountain Rose Herbs has really lovely pastilles that work quite nicely, so they're already broken up. But I do find that in the general commerce, a lot of times those pastilles are already rancid when you get them, which is really just pretty unfortunate. And it's surprising because beeswax normally, when it's in this hard state, has a really good shelf life and usually is not likely to go rancid. I have a beeswax chunk of about 1 ounce that I've been passing around in class now for over 10 years, and it's probably a little grimy and gross, but it actually hasn't gone rancid yet, so I don't know why granulated beeswax tends to be rancid in the commercial herb market, but oftentimes it is. So to break this up, you can do a couple different things. You could use a knife and do it that way. You could use a grater, but I really prefer this method that I learned from Nancy and Michael Phillips over in New Hampshire, where you wrap it up in a clean cloth and whack it with a hammer. So it's a little bit hardcore, but it's easier, it's faster, and you will potentially ruin your cloth, but besides that, it's pretty easy for the cleanup. In the case of using a knife or a grater, it's really difficult to get that beeswax off that grater, off that knife afterwards. So you could potentially end up ruining your kitchen supplies. So in this case, we just have a clean cloth that's going to get ruined. And so I like to use something that's kind of a nice tight weave. So an old dishcloth or an old cloth napkin works really well for this. And you're just going to wrap it up in that cloth. You could even do, we might even do 2 layers because sometimes it does kind of mangle that cloth a little bit. And then you want to go to a hard surface. We're going to do it right here because I feel like this is a pretty good surface to work on. But when I'm at home, sometimes I'll go out to like the stone wall or a brick area and do it there, or someplace that can really handle it. Definitely don't do it on like tile floors, or everything's going to kind of jump around. So just be careful about that. So choose your spot wisely where you can be banging on a hammer over it. So you can get your aggressions out this way. And then when you open it up, you have all these nice smaller chunks of beeswax that are going to be easier to melt, and you can just break them down to measure them. And the smaller they are, the faster they will melt down when exposed to heat. But if they're bigger, it's fine. I just usually like to melt my beeswax down first, and that way I'm exposing my oils to as little heat as possible. Beeswax does take a little effort to melt them down. They melt at a relatively high temperature. So we are going to do, for this recipe, it's about 1 ounce of beeswax per 4 ounces of oil, and you can easily multiply or divide that according to how much you want as a finished product. So if we have 4 parts oil and 1 part beeswax, we're going to end up with about 5 ounces of salve in the final product. And that can be handy to know if you're trying to make a set amount of jars. So I'm going to just weigh this out, but I already know in advance that it should have been about a 1 ounce block, so we should have exactly what we need here. But if you didn't, you could weigh it out. And it's actually much better to weigh your beeswax than to try to measure it with a measuring cup, especially because when it's chopped up, the volume is really variable. Technically, the weight and the volume are the same, but because you have all this airspace, it becomes really challenging to accurately measure it with a spoonful or a measuring cup. If you didn't have a scale and you didn't buy your beeswax in exactly the amount that you needed already, what you could do is measure by displacement. So you could take your container here, put your 4 ounces of oil in it, your liquid ingredients, and then add your beeswax to it until it goes up to the 5 ounce mark. And then you know through displacement that you have exactly 1 ounce of beeswax. So that's one way to get around it. But the downside to that is that means that you're probably going to now heat everything all up together. And so you're going to expose your oil to more heat than necessary. So we're going to plunk this into our double boiler, which is right over here. And we're coming up to temp here. You can use these lovely little double boiler inserts that Mountain Rose has. They've got 2 different sizes. This is the smaller one, and put that over a pot of water. You can also use an actual double boiler if you have it. And what I use at home is I just have a pan of water, and then I use a metal mixing bowl, and I kind of float that on top. And for recipes of this quantity, that works out really well too. So you don't necessarily need fancy equipment, but you can certainly use it if you have it. And we're gonna let that melt down. While that's melting down, I'm gonna also throw this drizzler spoon in it. So later on, once we get our oil in there and everything's all liquid, we're gonna wanna pour it into our containers. And you could pour it back into a Pyrex measuring cup like this and do it, but as soon as it hits that cooler Pyrex, it's gonna start to solidify. It can get a little bit messy. So I've started really liking to use drizzle spoons, and that way I can just heat them up right in there, and I can easily pour into even small things like our little lip balm tubes. We can pour into those without too much mess. And in classroom environments where I have people coming, at different times throughout the remedy making process, they can come up and pour, and things haven't all hardened up on them in the process. So I'm gonna put this in here just so it kind of comes up to temp with our beeswax. And then we're gonna let that melt down for a little bit, and then once the beeswax is melted down, then I'm gonna add the herbal oils and make that into a salve. So our beeswax is pretty much melted down now. You'll see that it's sort of like the consistency of olive oil or golden oil, and that's when I like to add my other oils. You could add it right in the same time, but I just like to protect the quality of the oil by exposing it to as little heat as possible. And so for this recipe, we have 1 ounce of beeswax, 4 ounces of oil, so I'm gonna measure out 4 ounces. And you could definitely do a mix of this as well. So if you wanted to do a little bit of plantain and a little bit of comfrey oil and a little bit of calendula oil, all those would go really nicely together in just kind of an all-purpose healing salve. And so we'll just put that in, and you'll notice that as it goes in, because the oil is a little on the cooler side, it's going to kind of congeal some of that beeswax, but then it melts down really quickly. It's kind of neat looking. This is such a beautiful color. And you could just do your salves with straight oil and beeswax, but you could add other ingredients as well. So we are going to add a little bit of lavender to this, but if you're going to add any things like essential oils or grapefruit seed extract or rose hip seed oil or any of those other ingredients that are a little bit more fragile, you'll want to wait until after everything else is melted down, remove it from the heat, and then add it to it. One of the things I love to do with the essential oils, especially when we're doing lip balms, or even if I just want to mix it up and maybe make some things have lavender in it, but then other things maybe have peppermint in it, and I'm working off the same batch, is I'll add the essential oil straight to the container that's empty before I pour the salve ingredients into it. And I love using these tubes not just for lip balms, but also for more general salves as well. If you're on the go, it's nice to have something little that fits in your backpack or your purse that you can pull out as needed. So we're almost melted down here, and remember that I'm keeping this right in here, my drizzle spoon, so that it stays warm and will resist things from congealing up on it. So we'll let that melt down. And I can even turn down my heat just a little bit before we get to that messy roaring boil stage. We're just about there. We might even be able to melt it down with the residual heat of the water. And so I'd say we're pretty close. There's a little bit that's on the actual spoon, but I'd say it's good enough. So I'm just going to remove that from heat. Move this over here. And so if I wanted to, I could go ahead and just pour right into my tube. And I like to do it right over, so if I dribble, it goes into it. I wait to put labels on until after this is done, because inevitably I get messy little dribbles. And I'll just use a little bit of a paper towel once everything's cooled and hardened to wipe that up. And the same thing with that salve jar, so I could just pour right into there. You don't have to add essential oils. They're actually also really nice without them. And typically with these, you want to let them harden completely before you put the lids on. They just keep a slightly nicer consistency that way. But if you wanted to, if you were like, all right, I know I want to put essential oils in all of this, you could just do that, and maybe about 15, 20 or so. And I'm just going to eyeball it. I'm not even measuring, but If we put this in as everything was melting down, we would make a nice aromatic room, but you wouldn't get that much of the lavender in your final product because it would all evaporate out before you have a chance to use it. And don't worry too much about those dribbles. You can clean them up later. We should just about, if I did my math right and all my containers are actually the size that they say they are, I should have just about enough for all the containers that we have here. But inevitably there's always a little bit of variation, so it's nice to have a few extras on hand or you might end up a little bit short. But look at how beautiful and green this salve is. This is a great remedy to keep on hand if you've got kids, summertime, you know, all the various skin woes that you might run into. It can be really supportive for that. And I love adding lavender to salves because it does help preserve it a little bit, but then it also is going to add additional healing support. Lavender does so many lovely things and will complement almost any healing skin salve. And we're getting down to the dregs here. Voila. So I'm just going to let those cool, and then I'll take a little paper towel and clean up any of my dribbles. You can put your labels on once everything's all said and done. These will keep for at least a year, especially if they're kept in a cool, dark, dry spot. If you left them in your car, they would go rancid after a while and they could get all melty. But this is kind of a good basic recipe. I think they actually keep a little better with the beeswax than they do when it's just a straight oil. And it makes a really lovely final product, whether you're choosing to sell it or give it away to friends or use it in your own household day-to-day uses. So I hope you enjoyed it. Have fun making your recipes and happy herbal adventures.